It started in a quiet clinic on a breezy Monday morning. The kind of day that felt uneventful, where routines unfolded like clockwork, and no one expected anything extraordinary to happen. Dr. Ann Carter was making her usual rounds, flipping through patient files, her mind already mapping out the treatments and follow-ups for the day ahead. She was a doctor who carried herself with quiet dignity. Patients knew her as compassionate, gentle, and thorough, though she never sought praise or recognition. For Ann, the work itself, the chance to heal, to help, was enough. The waiting area was filled with the soft hum of conversations and the rustle of magazines. Families sat patiently, children fidgeted with toys, and the occasional cough or sniffle punctuated the otherwise calm atmosphere. To most people, it was just another day. But not for Ann. Not today. As she exited an exam room, clipboard in hand, she noticed a young man standing awkwardly near the reception desk. He wasn't part of the usual crowd. Tall but lanky, maybe 16 or 17 years old, he had a nervous energy about him, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His clothes were simple jeans and a plain t-shirt, but his eyes, wide and intense, held a story that hadn't been told yet. "Dr. Carter," he said, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke. Ann paused, lowering her clipboard. The way he said her name, tentative, almost reverent, made her curious. She took a step closer, her brow furrowing slightly as she studied his face. He looked nervous, but there was something else there too. Gratitude. Admiration. She couldn't quite place it. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked, his words trembling with a mix of hope and uncertainty. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, as if bracing himself for her answer. Ann tilted her head, her mind racing to place him. She had seen thousands of patients over the years. Faces blurred together, stories overlapped. But there was something about his eyes, large, dark, and filled with emotion, that stirred a faint memory. She couldn't name it yet, but the feeling was there, tugging at the edges of her thoughts. "I'm sorry," she said gently, not wanting to discourage him. "I see so many patients, but you do seem familiar." The young man took a deep breath, as though summoning the courage to continue. "You saved my life," he said, his voice steady now, though his hands still fidgeted. "When I was just a baby." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ann felt her chest tighten. She blinked, her mind spinning as she tried to connect the dots. A baby? Her thoughts sifted through years of cases, fragile newborns, desperate parents, long nights spent by incubators or operating tables. She had dedicated her life to saving lives, but this felt personal. And yet, she couldn't quite grasp it. The room around them seemed to fade as the gravity of his words sank in. Ann's voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke. "I saved your life." The boy nodded, a small, almost shy smile creeping onto his face. His eyes, however, glistened with emotion. "Yes," he said softly. "You probably don't remember, but I've been waiting a long time to tell you." Ann's breath caught in her throat. Her mind flashed back to the early years of her career, the long hours, the sleepless nights. She remembered the helpless cries of newborns, the anxious faces of parents who clung to every word of hope she could offer. But who was this boy? And why, after all these years, had he come to find her? "Can you tell me more?" she asked, her voice gentle but tinged with curiosity. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the answer, but she knew she had to hear it. The boy hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment. "I don't know all the details," he admitted. "My parents didn't talk about it much. But I know I was born really early. The doctors told my mom and dad that I wouldn't survive. They said there was no hope." He paused, his voice cracking slightly. "But you didn't give up on me." Ann felt a chill run down her spine. Premature births. Tiny lungs that couldn't yet breathe on their own. Heart defects that seemed impossible to fix. She had faced countless cases like that, but only a handful had left an impression deep enough to linger in her memory. Could this boy be one of them? You stayed with me, he continued, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. That's what my mom told me. She said you refused to give up, even when everyone else thought it was pointless. Anne's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say. Her mind was now a whirlwind of memories, each one vying for her attention. But then, she looked into his eyes again, and suddenly, she remembered. A baby boy, born far too early. Weighing just over 2 pounds, his tiny body had been frail and underdeveloped, his chances of survival slim to none. She remembered the sleepless nights she'd spent in the NICU, monitoring his fragile condition, making adjustments to his treatment, praying silently that he'd pull through. His parents had been distraught, their hope hanging by a thread. And yet, somehow, against all odds, the baby had survived. But could it really be him? Are you, she began, her voice faltering as she searched for the right words. Are you that baby? The boy nodded again, his smile widening just a little. I've wanted to meet you for so long, he said. To thank you. You didn't just save my life, you gave me a chance to live it. Anne felt her heart swell with emotion. Her career had been filled with challenges and triumphs, but moments like this, moments of pure connection, where the impact of her work became undeniable, were rare. She had spent so many years wondering if her sacrifices had truly made a difference. And now, standing before her, was the answer. Thank you, she said softly, her voice barely audible. But the boy wasn't finished. He shifted his weight again, his expression growing more serious. There's something else, he said, his tone filled with quiet intensity. Something I've been waiting to tell you. Anne's pulse quickened. What could it be? What more could this young man have to say that hadn't already shaken her to her core? She braced herself, not knowing what was coming next. And then, with a small, almost shy smile, he said the words that would change everything. The boy's smile lingered, but his hands trembled as if carrying the weight of what he was about to say. Anne could see it, the buildup of emotions, the effort to steady himself. Whatever he was holding back, it was deeply important to him. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, his eyes darting to the side. I don't know where to start, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Take your time, Anne said gently. Her tone was calm, but inside, her heart raced. She stepped closer, her curiosity growing stronger. She couldn't let this moment slip by. The boy took a deep breath. You don't realize how much you changed everything for me, and for my family, he said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. When I was born, my parents told me later, everyone thought I wouldn't make it. They were told it would be better to let me go. Anne's chest tightened at his words. She'd heard this story too many times during her career. Premature babies born so fragile that even the smallest hope seemed like a cruel dream. Doctors advising parents to prepare for the worst, to save themselves the heartache of a prolonged struggle. But Anne had always believed that life, no matter how fragile, deserved every chance. It was why she had chosen this path. Do you remember them? He asked suddenly, his gaze meeting hers with a flicker of hope. My parents. Anne's mind churned, digging through years of memories. She wanted to give him an answer, but the details were hazy. She remembered the case, the tiny baby boy fighting against impossible odds. She remembered the endless nights by his incubator, making adjustments to keep him stable. And she remembered the parents, young, scared, clinging to a sliver of hope. But their faces remained blurry in her mind. I think I do, Anne replied carefully, not wanting to offer more than she could recall. Your case, it wasn't one I could forget. The boy nodded, seeming to accept her answer. My mom always said you were like an angel, he said softly. She said you were the only one who believed I could survive. Even when she was ready to give up, you didn't. Anne's throat tightened. The words hit her harder than she expected. She'd been called many things over her career: dedicated, stubborn, even overly optimistic, but Angel wasn't one of them. She didn't see herself that way. She was just a doctor doing her job. And yet, hearing those words now, spoken with such sincerity, made her wonder if she had underestimated the impact of her choices. The boy continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I grew up hearing bits and pieces about what happened. How small I was, how close I came to, he trailed off, swallowing hard. But my mom never wanted to talk about it too much. She said it was too painful to remember. Anne nodded, understanding completely. For many parents, the trauma of nearly losing a child was something they carried silently, a wound they never fully healed from. But for Anne, those stories had been her reality every day. She had lived in that tension, walking the line between life and loss, knowing that not every fight ended with a miracle. But she kept this, the boy said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small, worn photograph and held it out to her. Anne took it carefully, her fingers trembling as she turned it over. The image was grainy, but she recognized it instantly. It was her, years younger, sitting by an incubator. Her hair was pulled back, her face etched with exhaustion. She was leaning over, her hands carefully adjusting the tiny wires and tubes that kept a fragile newborn alive. And there, barely visible among the medical equipment, was the baby boy. Anne felt a lump rise in her throat. She remembered this moment now. It had been late at night, long after most of the staff had gone home. She had stayed behind, refusing to leave the little boy's side. She remembered the quiet hum of the machines, the dim glow of the monitors. She had been so tired, but she hadn't cared. All that had mattered was giving this baby a fighting chance. I didn't even know this photo existed, she said, her voice barely audible. The boy smiled. My mom took it. She said she wanted to remember the person who gave me life. Anne clutched the photograph tightly, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She had spent decades in this profession, often wondering if her efforts truly made a difference. And now, here was the proof. A living, breathing reminder that her work had mattered. You've grown so much, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and gratitude. To see you standing here now. I don't have the words. The boy chuckled softly, a sound that was both nervous and genuine. I wasn't sure if I should come, he admitted. I mean, what do you even say to the person who saved your life? Thank you doesn't feel like enough. Anne shook her head, a warm smile breaking through her tears. Hearing your story is more than enough, she said. But I have to ask, what made you decide to find me now, after all these years? The boy hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor again. There's something I've been wanting to do, he said slowly. And I couldn't take the next step until I found you. Anne's curiosity deepened. What is it? She asked gently. The boy looked up, his eyes filled with determination. I want to become a doctor, he said firmly. Because of you. Anne's breath caught. The words struck her like a wave, leaving her momentarily speechless. She had mentored many young medical students over the years, but this was different. This wasn't about inspiring someone to follow in her footsteps. This was about a life coming full circle. You want to be a doctor, she repeated, her voice filled with both wonder and disbelief. He nodded, his expression unwavering. I've thought about it for years, he said. Ever since I was old enough to understand what you did for me. I want to help people the way you helped me. To give someone else the same chance you gave me. Anne felt tears prick her eyes. She had always believed in the ripple effect of kindness, the idea that one small act could inspire a chain of good deeds. But she had never imagined seeing it unfold in such a profound way. "That's incredible," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." The boy smiled. "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "I just wanted you to know. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. And now, I want to carry that forward." And placed a hand over her heart, trying to steady herself. She had faced many challenges in her career, but this moment, this unexpected gift of gratitude and purpose, was unlike anything she had ever experienced. "You've already made me prouder than you could imagine," she said finally. "And if there's anything I can do to help you on your journey, you can count on me." The boy's face lit up with a smile that could have brightened the entire clinic. For a moment, neither of them spoke, letting the weight of their shared connection settle between them. The clinic buzzed around them, phones ringing, nurses calling out names, patients shuffling in and out, but for Anne and the boy, time seemed to stand still. This was more than a reunion. It was a moment of redemption, a reminder that even the smallest acts of persistence and compassion could echo through a lifetime. And as Anne looked at the boy standing before her, she realized something. It wasn't just her efforts that had saved him all those years ago. It was his own will to survive, his own quiet strength that had carried him through. And now, that strength was leading him toward a future she couldn't wait to see unfold. Anne had always brushed off compliments. To her, saving lives wasn't about glory or recognition, it was simply her duty. It was the vow she had taken when she became a doctor. But this felt different. The way the boy looked at her, the gravity in his voice, it carried a weight that hinted at a story far deeper than she had expected. Her curiosity grew with each passing moment. She wanted to know more, to piece together the fragments of a story she had unknowingly been a part of all those years ago. "Your parents must have told you more about it," Anne said cautiously, not wanting to push too hard. But the boy shook his head almost immediately, his expression a mix of frustration and sadness. "Not really," he said, his voice soft. "They never talked about it much. Anytime I brought it up, they'd just say, 'You're a miracle,' and that's all that matters. I've spent years trying to figure it all out on my own." And studied his face. The determination in his eyes was unmistakable, but so was the ache of unanswered questions. Whatever had happened back then, it had left a mark not just on him, but on his family as well. There was a silence between them now, heavy but not uncomfortable. And could feel the tension, the sense that there was more to the story, something that hadn't been said yet. Sometimes parents try to protect their children by not telling them everything, Anne said gently. Maybe it was too painful for them to relieve. "I know," the boy replied, nodding. "I used to get mad at them for not telling me more. But now, I think they were just scared. Scared of losing me back then, and maybe scared of what I'd feel if I knew everything now." Anne's chest tightened at his words. She had seen it before, the way trauma could linger in a family long after the crisis had passed. Parents who had spent weeks or months in the NICU, holding their breath every time the monitors beeped, often carried that fear for years. It shaped them, changed them, sometimes in ways they couldn't even explain. "Do you want to know what I remember?" Anne asked carefully. She wasn't sure how much she could offer. Her memories of the case were still hazy, but she wanted to help him fill in the blanks if she could. The boy's face lit up, a mixture of eagerness and hesitation. "Yes," he said quickly, then paused. "I mean, if you remember anything." Anne leaned against the edge of the reception desk, her mind reaching back to those early years of her career. "I remember a baby boy born too early," she began. "You were so small, barely more than 2 pounds. You had trouble breathing, your heart wasn't strong enough, and there were so many times we thought," she stopped herself, not wanting to scare him. "It was a hard fight," she said instead. "But you were strong, even then." The boy listened intently, hanging on to every word. His expression was a mix of awe and disbelief, as though he couldn't quite imagine himself as the fragile infant she described. But there was something else, and continued, her brow furrowing as she dug deeper into her memories. Something unusual about your case. I remember, your parents being afraid of more than just losing you. They seemed scared of someone. Or something. The boy's head shot up at her words. What do you mean? He asked, his voice sharp with urgency. Anne hesitated. She didn't want to alarm him, but the memory was growing clearer now. It's hard to explain, she said slowly. But I remember them being very private, very guarded. They didn't want to share too much about their situation, even with the hospital staff. At first, I thought it was just because they were overwhelmed. But now, looking back, she trailed off, unsure of how to put her thoughts into words. The boy's eyes darkened, and his jaw tightened. That sounds like them, he muttered, almost to himself. They always acted like there was something they were hiding. Especially my dad. And watched him closely, sensing that he was wrestling with something. Do you know what they were hiding? She asked gently. He shook his head, frustration flickering across his face. No. But I've always felt like there was more to the story. Like they were keeping something from me not because they didn't trust me, but because they were trying to protect me. Anne nodded, understanding all too well. Parents often shielded their children from the harsh realities of life, thinking it was for the best. But sometimes, those secrets left scars of their own. There's something else, the boy said suddenly, his voice low. Something I've never told anyone. Anne's curiosity deepened, but she remained silent, giving him the space to continue. When I was about 8 or 9, I found a box in the attic, he said, his words slow and deliberate. It was hidden under a pile of old blankets. Inside, there were a few baby pictures, my birth certificate, and a letter. Anne's heart quickened. A letter. He nodded, his expression distant, as though he were replaying the moment in his mind. It was addressed to my parents. I couldn't read all of it back then. I didn't understand some of the words, but it scared me. It said something about a mistake, about someone not being safe. And it mentioned my name. Anne felt a chill run down her spine. Do you still have it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy shook his head. No. When my parents found out I had the box, they got upset. My dad took it away, and I never saw it again. I tried asking about it later, but they just said it wasn't important. Anne's mind raced. What could that letter have been about? A mistake? Safety? The pieces didn't fit, but they hinted at something far more complex than she had imagined. I think that's why they were so protective, the boy continued. Not just because I was premature, but because of whatever was in that letter. I think they were scared it would come back to haunt them. Anne felt the weight of his words. She had always believed that saving his life had been the hardest part of his story, but now she realized there was so much more she didn't know. His survival had been just the beginning. Have you ever tried to find out more? She asked carefully. To look into what might have happened. The boy hesitated, then nodded. A few times, he admitted. But I always hit a dead end. My dad's side of the family doesn't talk to us anymore, and my mom, well, she doesn't like bringing up the past. And could see the frustration in his eyes, the yearning for answers that had gone unfulfilled for so long. She felt an ache in her chest not just for him, but for his parents as well. Whatever they had gone through, it had clearly taken a toll on all of them. You deserve to know the truth, Anne said softly. Whatever it is. The boy looked at her, his expression a mix of hope and doubt. Do you really think I can find it? He asked. After all this time. Anne placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. If there's one thing I've learned in my career, it's that the truth has a way of coming out, she said. Sometimes it takes longer than we'd like, but it's always there, waiting to be found. The boy nodded, his resolve hardening. I want to find it, he said firmly. Not just for me, but for my parents too. I think they've been carrying this for too long. And felt a swell of admiration for him. Despite the uncertainties, the unanswered questions, and the pain of not knowing, he was determined to uncover the truth not out of anger, but out of love. And as she looked at him, standing there with a mixture of strength and vulnerability, she realized that his story was far from over. The fight to save his life had been only the first chapter. What came next would be just as challenging, and perhaps even more important. Whatever you find, Anne said gently, remember this, your life, your strength, it's a testament to how much your parents loved you. They fought for you. And whatever they were hiding, I'm sure it was because they thought it was the best way to protect you. The boy nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Thank you, he said softly. For everything. Anne smiled, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She didn't have all the answers, not yet. But she knew one thing for certain, this young man had already overcome so much. And whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it. Together, they had started to uncover a story that was bigger than either of them, a story of survival, secrets, and the unbreakable bonds of love. Anne could sense the layers of conflict the boy was carrying, and though she didn't fully understand the depth of the story yet, she felt it was vital to help him find the truth. She leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. Let's start from what you know, she said. Even the smallest detail could help make sense of this. The boy nodded, his face a mix of relief and hesitation. I've been piecing things together for years, he began, but it always feels like I'm missing something important. Anne gestured for him to sit on the small bench near the window, and she joined him. Take your time, she said. There's no rush. He sighed, gathering his thoughts. I know I was born premature, he began. I've heard that part of the story more times than I can count. My mom always said I was her miracle baby, and she never let me forget how hard I fought to stay alive. But it wasn't just my health that made everything so tense back then. Anne tilted her head slightly, encouraging him to continue. My dad, the boy hesitated, as though unsure how much to say. He wasn't always the way he is now. These days, he's calm, quiet, almost like he's given up on the world. But when I was younger, he was so paranoid. He used to double-check every lock on the doors, stay up late pacing the living room, and anytime someone mentioned the hospital, he'd change the subject. Anne listened intently, her mind racing with questions. Did he ever explain why? The boy shook his head. Not really. If I asked, he'd just say something vague, like we've been through a lot or it's better not to dwell on the past. But I could see it in his eyes, whatever happened back then really shook him. Anne's brow furrowed as she tried to piece the fragments together. And your mom, she asked. Did she act the same way? She was different, the boy said, his voice softening. More optimistic, I guess. She always tried to make me feel like I was safe, like everything was okay. But sometimes, late at night, I'd hear her crying in the kitchen. I think she was carrying a lot of fear, too. She just didn't want me to see it. Anne's heart ached for him. It was clear that whatever had happened during his infancy had left deep scars not just on him, but on his entire family. She wondered how many nights his parents had spent worrying, how many years they had spent hiding their pain in an effort to protect their son. Do you think they were afraid of someone specific? Anne asked. Or was it more general, just the stress of having a premature baby? The boy hesitated, his brow furrowing as he considered her question. I think it was someone specific, he said finally. There were a few times when I'd hear my dad muttering under his breath, saying things like, we've come too far to let them take him or they won't find us. It was like he was scared of someone coming after me. Anne felt a chill run down her spine. Do you think it could have been a legal issue? She asked cautiously. Like a custody battle or something. The boy shook his head firmly. No. My parents have always been together. And there's nothing in my family history that would suggest something like that. It felt bigger than that. Like they were scared of an organization or a group. The room grew quiet as Anne processed his words. An organization? What could that mean? She thought back to her own time in the neonatal unit, trying to recall anything unusual about his case. But the memories were still too fragmented. I think the letter I found might have been a clue, the boy said, breaking the silence. I've replayed that moment in my head so many times, trying to remember exactly what it said. But it's all so fuzzy now. Anne placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Sometimes memories come back when you least expect them, she said. Don't force it, it'll come to you when the time is right. The boy nodded, though his frustration was evident. I just feel like I've been chasing ghosts, he said. Every time I get close to an answer, it slips away. Anne's mind was already formulating a plan. Have you ever thought about requesting your medical records? She asked. The hospital might still have files from when you were a baby. His eyes widened. I didn't even think of that, he admitted. Do you think they'd still have them after all these years? It's possible, Anne said. Hospitals are required to keep records for a certain number of years, and neonatal cases often get flagged for long-term retention. It's worth a try. The boy's expression shifted, a spark of hope lighting up his features. I'll do it, he said. I'll call the hospital as soon as I can. Anne nodded, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. And if you want, I can help you navigate the process, she offered. I might even be able to pull a few strings to speed things up. The boy's gratitude was evident. Thank you, he said, his voice trembling slightly. You don't know how much this means to me. Anne smiled, her resolve strengthening. She didn't know where this journey would lead, but she was determined to help him uncover the truth. Whatever had happened all those years ago, it was time for the secrets to come to light. As they sat there, the tension in the room began to shift. It was still present, but now it carried a sense of direction, a sense of purpose. The boy wasn't alone in his search anymore, and Anne wasn't just a bystander. Together, they were taking the first steps toward unraveling a mystery that had been buried for far too long. But as Anne glanced out the window, a nagging thought crept into her mind. What if the answers they found weren't what they expected? What if the truth was more dangerous than they realized? She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the determination in the boy's eyes. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. For now, that was enough. Anne leaned forward, her breath catching slightly at the boy's words. There was a gravity in his tone that sent a ripple of unease through her. She could see it in his eyes, a mix of fear and determination, as though he was about to reveal something that had been weighing on him for years. What is it? She asked, her voice soft but steady. The boy hesitated, his hands fidgeting in his lap. I've been having these dreams, he began, his words slow and deliberate. At least, I think they're dreams. But sometimes, they feel like memories. Anne raised an eyebrow, intrigued but unsure where he was going with this. What kind of dreams? She asked gently. He took a deep breath before continuing. They're always the same. I'm in a bright room, surrounded by people in white coats. There's this loud beeping sound like a machine and I feel trapped. I can't move, and everything feels cold. There's a voice, too. A man's voice. He's saying something, but I can never make out the words. And then, there's this flash of light, and I wake up. Anne's medical instincts kicked in immediately. The bright room, the beeping, it sounded like a neonatal intensive care unit. But the way he described it, the trapped feeling, the voice, it didn't quite align with a typical hospital experience. That could be a memory of the NICU, she said cautiously. Premature babies often spend weeks, sometimes months, in intensive care. It's possible your brain held onto fragments of that time, even if you don't consciously remember it. The boy shook his head, a frustrated look on his face. I thought so too, he admitted. But there's more. In the dream, I'm not just lying there. I feel like someone is doing something to me. Like I'm part of an experiment. Anne's stomach tightened. An experiment, she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. He nodded, his eyes locked on hers. I know it sounds crazy, he said quickly, but it feels so real. And it's not just the dreams. There are other things that don't add up. Anne leaned back slightly, her mind racing. What kind of things? She asked, her tone more curious than skeptical. For starters, my medical records don't match what my parents told me, he said. I managed to get a copy a few years ago, but parts of it are blacked out like they've been redacted. And there are entries that don't make sense. One of them says I was transferred to another facility for a special procedure, but my parents never mentioned that. When I asked my mom about it, she just got really quiet and said I shouldn't dig too deep. And frowned. Did the record say where you were transferred? No, he replied. It just says external facility with no name or address. And the date doesn't match up with what my mom told me about my time in the hospital. It's like there's a whole part of my story that's missing. Anne felt a knot forming in her chest. She'd seen redacted medical records before, but they were usually tied to sensitive cases often involving legal disputes, experimental treatments, or even government involvement. The fact that this boy's records contained similar omissions was deeply troubling. Have you found anything else? She asked, her voice steady despite the growing unease inside her. He nodded slowly. A few months ago, I found an old newspaper article online, he said. It was about a scandal at a medical research facility. They were accused of conducting unauthorized experiments on premature babies. The article didn't mention any names, but the timeline matches the year I was born. And the location? It was just a few miles from the hospital where I was delivered. Anne's breath caught. Do you think you were one of those babies? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy looked at her, his eyes filled with both fear and certainty. I don't know, he admitted. But I can't shake the feeling that I was. And if I was, what did they do to me? Anne felt a chill run down her spine. She wanted to dismiss the idea as paranoia, as the product of a vivid imagination and too many unanswered questions. But the more she listened, the more she realized that the pieces were beginning to form a picture one she didn't like. Did the article mention anything specific about the experiments? She asked, her professional instincts kicking in. What they were trying to accomplish? The boy hesitated, then nodded. It said they were studying something called enhanced resilience. They wanted to see if they could make premature babies stronger physically, mentally, even emotionally. But the methods they used, they were unethical. Some of the babies didn't survive. Anne's hands clenched into fists. The thought of anyone using vulnerable infants as test subjects made her blood boil. That's monstrous, she said, her voice trembling with anger. If what you're saying is true, then whoever was responsible should be held accountable. The boy nodded, his expression hardening. That's what I want to find out, he said. I want to know if I was part of it. And if I was. I want to know why my parents never told me. Anne took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Your parents might not have known, she said carefully. If this was a secret experiment, it's possible they were kept in the dark. I've thought about that, he admitted. But there are things they've said, little slips that make me think they knew more than they're letting on. Like when I was 12, and I broke my arm falling off my bike. The doctors said I'd need surgery, but when my dad found out, he panicked. He kept saying, no more procedures, no matter what. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, it makes me wonder. Anne's heart ached for him. The boy wasn't just searching for answers, he was grappling with the possibility that the people who had raised him, who had fought to keep him alive, might have been complicit in something terrible. Have you confronted them about any of this? She asked gently. He shook his head. Not directly, he said. I've tried asking questions, but they always shut me down. My mom gets emotional, and my dad just changes the subject. It's like they're hiding something, but I don't know if it's because they're guilty or because they're scared. Anne felt a wave of sympathy wash over her. She could see the weight this boy was carrying, the burden of unanswered questions and half-remembered fragments. He was caught in a web of mystery and fear, and he had no one to guide him through it. You're incredibly brave for trying to find the truth, she said, her voice filled with sincerity. I know it's not easy, but you deserve to know what happened to you. The boy looked at her, his expression softening. Thank you, he said quietly. For believing me. Most people just tell me to let it go. Anne shook her head firmly. You can't let something like this go, she said. Not until you have answers. The boy nodded, his determination reigniting. Then I need your help, he said. You were there when I was born. You're the only person who might remember what really happened. Anne hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to help him, but she also knew that digging into the past could uncover things neither of them was prepared for. Still, she couldn't ignore the look in his eyes, the hope, the desperation. I'll do what I can, she said finally. But we'll need to be careful. If there's a cover-up, we might be stepping into dangerous territory. The boy nodded, his resolve unshaken. I'm ready, he said. Whatever it takes. Anne felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. This young man had already endured so much, and yet he was willing to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She didn't know where their search for answers would lead, but one thing was certain, they were in this together. And together, they would uncover the truth. Anne couldn't shake the uneasiness that had settled in the room. As the boy spoke, her memories of his case long buried under years of practice started to resurface in flashes. She remembered the night he'd been admitted, the frantic calls for her assistance, the helpless faces of his parents, and the fragile infant who clung to life with a strength that defied his tiny body. But beyond those moments, her recollection grew hazy, like pages torn out of a book. Let's take this one step at a time, she said, steadying herself. First, we'll see if the hospital archives have anything about your transfer or that special procedure. That could give us a clearer picture of what happened. If the answers aren't there, we'll keep digging. The boy nodded, his determination unwavering. I've come this far. I'm not stopping now. Anne admired his resolve, but the part of her that had seen too much of the world's darker side felt the need to warn him. You should prepare yourself, she said. If there's something buried here, it might not be easy to face. Sometimes, the truth can be more painful than the questions. The boy's gaze didn't falter. Painful or not, I need to know. Anne nodded, respect for his courage growing. Then let's get started. The following week was a whirlwind of phone calls, emails, and dead ends. Anne reached out to the hospital's records department, but as she'd feared, there were gaps in the boy's file. Some documents had been flagged for restricted access, while others simply weren't there at all. It's odd, the records clerk told her over the phone. Usually, we'd have a full archive of neonatal cases like this, especially if there was a transfer involved. But for some reason, parts of this file are missing. It's like they were removed on purpose. Anne's chest tightened. Is there any way to find out who accessed the file or why it was altered? She asked. The clerk hesitated. I'll check the logs, but don't get your hopes up. If someone wanted to cover their tracks, they'd have wiped the access history, too. When Anne relayed the news to the boy, His frustration was palpable. "It's like they don't want me to know what happened," he said, pacing the small exam room where they'd agreed to meet. "Why would someone go to all this trouble to hide the truth about a baby?" Anne didn't have an answer, but she knew they couldn't stop there. "There might be another way," she said. "You mentioned that article about the research facility. Do you still have it?" The boy pulled out his phone and quickly brought up a bookmarked page. He handed it to her, and Anne scanned the article carefully. It was dated nearly 2 decades ago, shortly after the boy's birth. The piece detailed allegations of unauthorized experiments at a private research facility called Genexes Labs. According to the article, Genexes had partnered with hospitals to conduct clinical trials on premature infants, but a whistleblower had come forward with claims that the experiments went far beyond what was legally or ethically permissible. Anne's hands tightened around the phone as she read further. The article mentioned enhanced resilience experiments, just as the boy had said, but it also hinted at something more disturbing: genetic modifications. The whistleblower alleged that some of the procedures involved altering the infant's DNA to see if they could program certain traits, like advanced immunity or heightened resistance to disease. Genexes Labs, Anne murmured, her stomach churning. "I remember hearing about this when I was a resident. It was a huge scandal, but the story disappeared from the news almost as quickly as it broke." The boy nodded. "That's what I found, too. It's like someone shut it all down. No follow-ups, no trials, nothing. It's like it never happened." Anne's mind raced. If Genexes had been involved with his care, that would explain the missing records and the secrecy surrounding his case. But it also raised more questions. Had his parents known? And if so, why hadn't they told him? "I think we need to find this whistleblower," Anne said, handing the phone back to him. "If anyone knows what really happened, it's them." The boy's face lit up with hope. "Do you think they're still around?" Anne nodded. "It's possible. People who come forward like that usually do so because they want the truth to come out. If we can track them down, they might be able to fill in the gaps." Tracking down the whistleblower proved to be easier said than done. The article didn't include a name, referring to the source only as an anonymous employee of Genexes Labs. Anne and the boy spent hours scouring old news archives and forums, hoping to find even the smallest clue about the whistleblower's identity. Eventually, they hit on a lead: a now-defunct blog where someone claiming to be a former Genexes employee had posted about the experiments. The posts were chilling. The blogger, who went by the pseudonym Phoenix Rising, described the experiments in graphic detail. They wrote about how the infants were subjected to invasive procedures, how some of them had reacted violently to the treatments, and how the staff were pressured to falsify records to cover up the deaths. One post in particular caught Anne's attention. There was one baby who survived the program, a miracle, they called him. He wasn't supposed to make it, but he did. I can't forget his face. I think about him every day and wonder if he's okay, if he even knows what they did to him. I hope he's out there somewhere, living a good life." Anne's hands trembled as she read the words aloud. The boy's face paled. "That has to be me," he whispered. "I'm the baby they're talking about." Anne nodded, her voice shaky. "It's possible," she said. "But we need to be sure. We need to find this person." They scoured the blog for more information, but the posts were nearly a decade old, and there were no contact details. However, one of the posts mentioned a city, Cedar Ridge. It was a small town about 2 hours away from where they were. "That's our next stop," Anne said, determination hardening her voice. The drive to Cedar Ridge was filled with tension and anticipation. The boy sat in the passenger seat, clutching the printed copies of the blog posts like they were a lifeline. Anne couldn't help but glance at him occasionally, marveling at his resilience. For someone who had spent most of his life in the dark, he carried himself with a quiet strength that she found inspiring. When they arrived in Cedar Ridge, Their first stop was the local library. It was a long shot, but Anne hoped they might find something in the archives or on the public computers. Hours passed as they combed through old articles and online records, but just as they were about to give up, the boy found something, a comment thread on an old forum for whistleblowers. One of the users, who went by the handle Rising Phoenix 82, had left a comment saying they were finally ready to talk and provided an email address. Though the thread was years old, the email address was still active. Anne and the boy quickly composed a message, explaining who they were and why they were reaching out. Then, all they could do was wait. 3 days later, they received a reply. The email was short and cautious, but it offered a glimmer of hope. If you're serious about finding the truth, meet me at the Cedar Ridge Diner tomorrow at 2 p.m. Come alone. I'll be in the back booth. Anne and the boy exchanged a nervous glance. They didn't know what to expect, but they knew this could be the breakthrough they'd been searching for. The next day, they arrived at the diner a few minutes early. The boy was visibly anxious, his hands shaking as he sipped a glass of water. Anne placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together," she said. At exactly 2 p.m., a middle-aged woman with a weathered face and sharp eyes walked into the diner. She scanned the room before making her way to the back booth. Anne and the boy followed, their hearts pounding. The woman introduced herself as Evelyn Ward, a former lab technician at Genex's labs. She wasted no time getting to the point. "I knew this day would come," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "I've been waiting for someone to find me." Evelyn's story was both horrifying and enlightening. She confirmed everything the boy had suspected, the experiments, the cover UPS, and his role in the program. She described how he had been chosen as a test case for the most extreme procedures, and how, against all odds, he had survived. "But they didn't just save your life," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "They changed it. You're not just a survivor, you're an experiment." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and Anne felt the weight of them settle over the boy. His entire life had been leading to this moment, and now that the truth was finally out, it felt both liberating and crushing. "What did they do to me?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn hesitated, then leaned in closer. "They gave you something no one else has," she said. "Something that could change everything." But before she could explain further, the sound of a car screeching to a halt outside the diner shattered the moment. Anne turned toward the window just in time to see two men in dark suits stepping out of an unmarked vehicle. "They found me," Evelyn said, panic flashing in her eyes. "We need to go. Now." Anne's breath caught as she stared at the photograph. The image was a ghost from her past, pulling her back to that one unforgettable night. Her younger self looked both terrified and resolute, her gloved hands cradling a newborn so small it seemed impossible he could survive. She remembered the adrenaline coursing through her veins as she refused to let go, working tirelessly through the night when everyone else had given up hope. And now, here he was standing before her, not just alive but carrying a dream shaped by her actions. The weight of his words hit her like a tidal wave. He wasn't simply thanking her for saving his life, he was telling her she had inspired his purpose. "I don't even know what to say," Anne whispered, her voice thick with emotion. This is incredible." But the boy wasn't finished. His hands trembled as he placed the photo back into his backpack. "There's something else I need to tell you," he said, his voice quieter now, as if he was revealing a closely guarded secret. "Something I've only started to piece together." Anne straightened, sensing the gravity in his tone. "What is it?" He hesitated, as though summoning the courage to speak. "When I was little, my parents always told me I was a miracle. But as I got older, I started noticing things about me that didn't feel normal." "What do you mean?" Anne asked, leaning forward. The boy fidgeted with the strap of his backpack, his eyes fixed on the floor. I've never been sick, he said finally. Not even once. Not a cold, not the flu, nothing. I heal really fast, too. Like, weirdly fast. I once broke my wrist skateboarding, and it was fine in 2 days. Anne's brows knitted together as her medical instincts kicked in. That's unusual, she admitted cautiously. Have you ever talked to a doctor about it? He shook his head. No. I was scared too. I didn't want anyone to think I was. I don't know, a freak or something. You're not a freak, Anne said firmly. But this isn't something you should ignore. It could be connected to what happened when you were a baby. He nodded. That's what I'm starting to think, too. Especially after what I've learned about Genex's labs. At the mention of the lab, Anne's chest tightened. The memories of their earlier discoveries came rushing back: the missing records, the experiments, the whistleblower's blog. She felt a growing unease as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Do you think they did something to me? He asked, his voice trembling. Anne didn't want to alarm him, but she also couldn't lie. It's possible, she said carefully. But we don't have enough information yet to know for sure. He nodded, taking a deep breath as though steeling himself for what was to come. That's why I want to keep digging. I need to know the truth, no matter what it is. The following week, Anne and the boy returned to Evelyn Ward, the former lab technician who had been the whistleblower behind the Genex's Labs scandal. They met her in a secluded location this time, away from prying eyes. Evelyn was clearly nervous, but she seemed determined to help. You need to understand something, Evelyn said, her voice low and urgent. What Genex's was doing, it was unprecedented. They weren't just trying to save premature babies, they were trying to rewrite what it means to be human. Anne felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? They called it adaptive resilience enhancement, Evelyn explained. The goal was to create children who could survive anything: disease, injury, even aging. But it wasn't just about survival. They wanted to see if they could make these kids stronger, faster, smarter. The boy shifted uncomfortably in his seat. And I was one of those kids. Evelyn nodded. You were the first. The test case. They called you Project Phoenix. Anne's heart sank as she processed Evelyn's words. But why was his case so secretive, she asked. Why didn't his parents know the full extent of what was happening? Evelyn sighed. Because they weren't told the truth. Genex's presented the procedure as a last-ditch effort to save his life. They made it sound like it was the only chance he had. But in reality, they were using him to test their theories. The boy's face hardened. So I was just an experiment to them, he said bitterly. A lab rat. Evelyn reached out, her expression pained. You weren't just an experiment, she said. You were a breakthrough. The procedure worked, but it worked too well. When the higher UPS saw the results, they panicked. They shut everything down and erased all the records. They didn't want anyone to know what they'd done. Anne felt a surge of anger. Why? Why hide something that could save lives? Because it wasn't perfect, Evelyn said grimly. There were side effects. And the ethical implications were too dangerous. If the public found out what Genex's had done, it would have destroyed them. What kind of side effects? Anne asked, her stomach churning. Evelyn hesitated, glancing at the boy. You said you've never been sick, right? She asked. He nodded. Yeah. And you heal faster than normal. Yeah. Evelyn took a deep breath. That's because your immune system and your cells regenerate at an accelerated rate. It's why you've never been sick. But it's also why they stopped the program. They realized that in trying to make you stronger, they might have made you unstable. Unstable how? The boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The cells that heal you so quickly, they don't stop regenerating. Over time, they could start to mutate. There's a risk that your body could turn against itself. Anne's heart sank as the implications hit her. You're saying he could develop cancer? Or something worse, Evelyn said. We don't know. The program was shut down before we could study the long-term effects. The boy's face went pale. So I'm a ticking time bomb, he said, his voice hollow. No, Anne said firmly, placing a hand on his shoulder. You're not a bomb. You're a miracle. And if there's any risk, we'll face it together. You're not alone in this. Evelyn nodded. She's right. And if there's one thing I know, it's that you're stronger than anyone ever gave you credit for. The boy took a deep breath, his resolve returning. Then we'll figure this out, he said. We'll find a way to make sure I'm okay. And I'm still going to be a doctor. I'm not letting this stop me. Anne felt a surge of pride as she looked at him. He had been through so much, and yet he refused to let it define him. In that moment, she knew he was destined for greatness not because of what Genexes had done to him, but because of the strength and compassion that came from within. As they left Evelyn's house that evening, the boy turned to Anne and said, "Thank you. For everything. I wouldn't have gotten this far without you." Anne smiled, her heart full. "You're the one who's done all the hard work," she said. "I'm just here to cheer you on." But as they drove away, Anne couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of his journey. There were still so many questions left unanswered, and she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Yet one thing was certain, no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Anne and the boy sat in the car for a long moment after leaving Evelyn's house. The weight of everything they had learned pressed down on them like a heavy fog. The boy stared out the window, his reflection ghostly against the glass. "Do you think she's right?" he asked quietly. "About me being unstable?" Anne turned to him, her voice gentle but firm. "What I think is that you're here right now. You're strong, healthy, and determined. That's what matters." He nodded but didn't respond, his jaw tight as if he were holding back an avalanche of emotion. Anne gave him the space he needed, understanding that processing the truth would take time. For now, they had more immediate concerns. The next few days were a whirlwind. They began searching for any remaining threads that might lead them to the full story behind Project Phoenix. Evelyn had given them a few names, former colleagues who might know more, but tracking them down proved to be a challenge. Most had moved away, changed careers, or simply vanished. The secrecy surrounding Genexes Labs was deeper than they had imagined. One name, however, stood out: Dr. Lawrence Grant. He had been one of the lead scientists on the project, according to Evelyn, and had reportedly left the field shortly after the lab shut down. A quick online search revealed that he was now living in a remote cabin outside of the city. The boy was hesitant. What if he doesn't want to talk to us? What if he's part of the cover-up? Anne shook her head. If he wanted to stay hidden, he wouldn't have left his name in the records Evelyn found. It's worth a shot. The drive to Dr. Grant's cabin took them deep into the mountains. The air grew colder, and the winding roads were flanked by towering pines. As they pulled up to the small wooden house, Anne noticed how isolated it was: no neighbors, no cell service, no distractions. It was the perfect place for someone who didn't want to be found. Dr. Grant answered the door cautiously, his lined face and weary eyes betraying a life lived under the shadow of secrets. Anne introduced herself and the boy, explaining why they had come. At first, he hesitated. "I left that part of my life behind for a reason," he said gruffly. But when the boy pulled out the photograph of Anne holding him as a baby, something shifted in Dr. Grant's demeanor. He stepped aside and motioned for them to come in. The cabin was modest but cozy, with shelves lined with books and a fire crackling in the stone hearth. Dr. Grant sat across from them, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Project Phoenix was the pinnacle of my career, he began, his voice tinged with both pride and regret. We were trying to push the boundaries of medical science, to create a treatment that could save lives in ways we'd never imagined. But the ethics, they got lost along the way. He explained how the project had started with good intentions, helping premature babies like the boy, who had almost no chance of survival. But as the experiments progressed, the focus shifted. The investors wanted results that could be commercialized, enhancements that could be sold to the highest bidder. Your case was our first success, Dr. Grant said, looking directly at the boy. But it scared us. Your body responded to the treatment in ways we didn't anticipate. You became extraordinary. And that terrified the people in charge. Why? The boy asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. Because extraordinary is unpredictable, Dr. Grant replied. They didn't know how far the changes in your body would go, or what the long-term effects would be. When the higher UPS realized they couldn't control it, they shut everything down. They ordered us to destroy all the data and pretend it never happened. But you didn't destroy everything, Anne said, her eyes narrowing. Dr. Grant hesitated, then nodded. I couldn't bring myself to do it. I kept some of the records, hoping that one day they might help someone understand what we did and maybe even fix the mistakes we made. Anne felt a spark of hope. Do you still have them? Dr. Grant stood and walked over to a small safe hidden behind a bookshelf. He unlocked it and pulled out a thick folder, worn with age. Inside were handwritten notes, diagrams, and pages of data. He handed it to the boy. This is everything I have, he said. It might not give you all the answers, but it's a start. Back at Anne's house, they spread the documents across the dining table, poring over the information late into the night. The boy was mesmerized by the intricate details of the procedure that had saved his life and changed it forever. This is insane, he said, holding up a diagram of the experimental serum. They were literally rewriting my DNA. Anne nodded, her eyes scanning a set of notes written in Dr. Grant's careful script. It's groundbreaking, no doubt. But they were playing with fire. The risks were enormous. They discovered that the serum had been designed to activate dormant genes responsible for cellular repair and regeneration. In theory, it could make the body virtually impervious to disease and injury. But the notes also hinted at unforeseen consequences, potential genetic instability that could lead to unpredictable mutations. This explains the accelerated healing, Anne said, her mind racing. Your cells are regenerating at a rate far beyond normal. But if they keep doing that indefinitely, they could go haywire, the boy finished, his voice grim. Anne reached across the table and placed a hand on his. We'll figure this out. You're not a science experiment anymore. You're a person, and we'll find a way to make sure you're safe. The next step was to consult a geneticist, someone who could analyze the boy's DNA and determine whether there were any immediate dangers. Anne reached out to an old colleague, Dr. Priya Sharma, who specialized in genetic research. She agreed to meet them at her lab under strict confidentiality. Dr. Sharma was both fascinated and horrified by what she found in the boy's blood samples. This is beyond anything I've ever seen, she said, examining the data on her computer screen. Your cells are like a symphony playing at double speed. It's incredible, but it's also unstable. If we don't intervene, there's a chance things could spiral out of control. What kind of intervention? The boy asked. Dr. Sharma hesitated. There's no easy answer. We'd need to develop a treatment specifically tailored to your DNA. It could take years or it might not work at all. The boy's shoulders sagged, but Anne stepped in. We're not giving up, she said firmly. We'll do whatever it takes. Dr. Sharma nodded. In the meantime, you'll need regular monitoring. If anything changes, anything at all, we need to know immediately. Despite the challenges ahead, the boy remained determined. He threw himself into his studies, inspired by the dream of becoming a doctor, and watched with pride as he balanced the weight of his past with the promise of his future. He was more than just a survivor, he was a fighter, and she knew he would make a difference in the world. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: his story was far from over. Together, they would face whatever came next, armed with courage, hope, and the unshakable bond they had forged. In the end, it wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about what they chose to do with it. And for the boy who had once been a fragile newborn, it was about proving that even the smallest lives could make the biggest impact. Anne blinked back tears as she stood there, facing the young man she had once held in her arms all those years ago. He was no longer the fragile, tiny baby she had fought so hard to save. He was strong, determined, and now, more than ever, he was her equal in every way. She had spent decades doubting whether her sacrifices, those missed family moments, the sleepless nights, the constant self-doubt had truly made any difference in the world. There were days when it felt like she was just going through the motions, helping one patient after another, but never really making a mark. Her dedication to medicine, to saving lives, often felt like a lonely road with few signs of success. But now, standing here in this moment with this boy, this man, she realized that her work had not been in vain. The boy, now a young man, was standing tall in front of her, his eyes filled with the same warmth that had once been part of his fragile, newborn self. The life that Anne had fought so hard to save, the one that had been so uncertain, was now a life that had purpose, a life with a future. He was not just alive, he was thriving. "You have no idea what this means to me," Anne said softly, her voice unsteady with emotion. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "But remember, the strength you carry isn't just mine. It's yours. It always was." Her words hung in the air between them, filled with the weight of everything they had been through together, everything they had yet to face. She watched as the boy smiled through his own tears, his eyes brimming with gratitude and understanding. In that moment, they both understood that this wasn't just about saving a life. It was about forging a connection, an unspoken bond that would remain with them forever. The boy's face softened as he took a step closer. "I never knew what I could become," he said quietly. "But seeing you here now, seeing the way you've dedicated your life to helping others, it makes me want to do the same. You've been my inspiration, Dr. Carter. I want to help people the way you did. I want to give others a chance, just like you gave me a chance." Anne's heart swelled with pride, but she could hardly speak. She had spent so many years doubting her impact, wondering if her sacrifices had ever truly mattered. But in that one simple moment, everything became clear. The strength she had shown, the determination, the willingness to fight against all odds, it had created a ripple effect that stretched far beyond herself. It had given this boy the chance to live, and now it was inspiring him to reach for something greater. She stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of reassurance and pride. "You already have everything inside you to make that difference," she said softly. "All you need is to believe in it. You've already overcome so much. You're stronger than you know." He looked down at the ground for a moment, then back up at her. His voice was low, but filled with sincerity. "Thank you, Dr. Carter. For never giving up on me." As the boy stood there, looking at her with such admiration, Anne couldn't help but think back to that night so many years ago when she had stayed by his side in the neonatal ICU. She had watched over him as he fought for every breath, every heartbeat. She had done everything she could, even when it seemed like there was no hope left. And now, here he was, a young man with dreams of his own, ready to carve out a future that he had once never believed was possible. It wasn't just about saving lives, Anne realized. It was about the impact those lives could have. It was about the potential for change, for growth, and for hope. And in the case of this boy, she could see that hope had blossomed into something beautiful. He wasn't just alive, he was living with purpose. As the two of them stood there in that quiet room, the weight of their shared history settled between them. There was no need for further words, everything had already been said in the way they looked at each other. They were bound by an invisible thread, one that had been formed through years of struggle, sacrifice, and an unwavering belief in the power of life. But their story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The boy, now more determined than ever, embarked on the path toward becoming a doctor. He began his journey with a newfound sense of purpose, enrolling in medical school and throwing himself into his studies. Anne, though busy with her own work, made it a point to mentor him when she could, offering advice and support as he navigated the challenges of medical school. He faced obstacles, as all students do, but there was something different about him now. He had the resolve and resilience that had been instilled in him from the moment of his birth, and he applied that same strength to every challenge he faced. Anne watched from the sidelines, filled with pride as she saw him grow and thrive. It was clear that he was becoming the kind of doctor she had always hoped he would be, a compassionate, dedicated physician who truly understood the value of life. But the impact of their story didn't end there. Word began to spread about the young man who had survived against all odds, about the doctor who had saved him and helped him become who he was. People from all walks of life reached out, inspired by the incredible journey they had both shared. The boy's story was one of hope and resilience, and it became a beacon for those who needed to hear that there was always a chance, always a way forward, no matter how dark things might seem. Anne, too, began to receive recognition for the work she had done. Though she had never sought accolades or praise, the public took notice of the difference she had made in so many lives. But more than the recognition, what meant the most to her was the knowledge that the work she had done was still having an impact, that the lives she had touched were continuing to touch others in ways she could never have imagined. As Anne sat in her office one day, reflecting on all that had happened, she received a letter in the mail. It was from the boy, now a young doctor in his own right. He wrote, "Dear Dr. Carter, I've finished my residency, and I'm about to start my own practice. I want you to know that none of this would have been possible without you. You saved my life, and now I'm living it to the fullest. You showed me the power of perseverance, the importance of kindness, and the strength that lies within all of us. I will carry that with me every day as I go forward. Thank you for everything. Sincerely." His name. Anne held the letter in her hands, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. In that moment, she realized that her work, her sacrifices, and her dedication had not only saved a life but had helped that life reach its fullest potential. The journey had been long and difficult, but the rewards had been immeasurable. Anne had been given the gift of seeing the full circle of her impact. The boy she had saved all those years ago had become the man she had always hoped he would be: strong, capable, and ready to help others. As she sat back in her chair, she couldn't help but smile. She had done more than just save a life. She had given someone the chance to make a difference in the world. And in the end, that was the greatest reward of all. As the boy left the clinic that day, Anne stood by the door, watching him walk down the hallway, his shoulders straight, his head held high. She couldn't help but think about the journey they had both just shared. It was strange how one moment, one decision, could shape the course of so many lives. When she had first met him, so many years ago, he had been nothing more than a tiny, fragile baby fighting for breath. Now, here he was alive, strong, and ready to give back to the world in the way she had given to him all those years ago. She thought about the many patients she had treated over her long career, so many of them struggling, so many of them fighting for their lives. Some of them had pulled through, others had not. And yet, for each person, she had given everything she had. She had stayed late, worked overtime, and sacrificed pieces of her own life to make sure that her patients got the best care possible. It hadn't always been easy. There had been moments of doubt, moments when she wondered if her efforts were worth it, if she was truly making a difference. But now, standing there, thinking of this boy, the young man who had walked into her clinic that morning, she realized that sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness, the smallest acts of courage, could make the biggest difference. Anne had never sought recognition. She had never wanted anyone to praise her for the sacrifices she had made or the hard work she had put in. To her, it was just part of the job. She had taken an oath to do everything she could to help those in need. But now, looking at the boy who had survived against all odds, looking at the man he had become, she understood something deeper. Her work, her decisions, had ripple effects. The care she had shown to this baby had not just saved one life, it had saved many. And the love, the persistence, the willingness to fight against the odds, it wasn't just for that moment, or even for the boy himself. It was something that would continue on, reaching beyond what she could see, touching the lives of people she would never meet. Anne walked back to her desk, her mind full of thoughts. She picked up a pen, staring at the paper before her, but not really seeing it. Her hands were steady, but her heart was full. She realized that the moments when she had stayed late, when she had chosen to push forward instead of giving up, those moments mattered. It hadn't always felt like it, but now she understood. Her work had meant something. It had meant more than just the long hours, the sleepless nights, and the quiet sacrifices she had made. It had meant giving someone a chance to live, a chance to fulfill a purpose, a chance to touch the world. In life, it was easy to get lost in the noise, the constant rush, the endless tasks, the pressure to achieve more, to do more. But in those quiet moments, when Anne would sit with a patient, when she would listen to their struggles and their hopes, she realized something important: every life mattered. Every person, no matter how small or fragile, had the potential to make a difference. And sometimes, it was the smallest acts of kindness, the smallest moments of courage, that could change everything. She thought back to that day when the boy had been born, so tiny, so vulnerable. The doctors had told his parents to prepare for the worst. But Anne had refused to give up. She had stayed by his side, working tirelessly through the night, doing everything she could to give him a chance. And now, many years later, that same boy was standing in front of her, telling her that he wanted to follow in her footsteps. He wanted to become a doctor. He wanted to help others the way she had helped him. And couldn't help but smile to herself. She had done her job. She had given that boy the gift of life, and now he was giving it back to the world in his own way. It was a cycle, a beautiful, never-ending cycle of hope and kindness. It was proof that the work she had done mattered, that every patient, every life, had a purpose. Her thoughts wandered to the people she had cared for over the years. There were so many of them, some she had seen through to the end, and others whose paths had crossed hers for only a short time. She thought about the families who had thanked her, the ones who had looked at her with tears in their eyes, knowing that she had done everything in her power to save their loved ones. It wasn't always the grand gestures that made the difference. Sometimes, it was the simple acts of compassion, the moments when Anne had chosen to be there, to listen, to comfort. She thought about the patients who had never made it, the ones who had slipped away despite her best efforts. In those moments, she had felt powerless. She had wondered if there was more she could have done, if there had been a way to save them. But now, with the boy's words still echoing in her mind, Anne realized something important: saving a life didn't always mean stopping death. Sometimes, it meant giving someone the strength to keep going, even when the odds were stacked against them. It meant giving them the tools to find their way, even in the darkest moments. And sometimes, it meant offering them the hope they needed to see a better future. As she sat at her desk, her eyes caught the sunlight streaming through the window. The light was soft, warm, almost like a promise. Anne knew that her work wasn't over. There would always be more people to help, more lives to touch, more challenges to face. But now, She had something new, a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of the impact she had on the world. She stood up from her desk and walked over to the window, looking out at the bustling street below. The world was full of people she would never meet, people she would help in ways she might never know. And yet, she understood now that the most powerful thing she could give them was hope. Hope that they could make it through the hardest times, hope that they could achieve their dreams, hope that they were never alone. And smiled to herself. Sometimes, saving one life meant saving many. And sometimes, the smallest acts of courage, staying just one more hour, refusing to give up, could leave a legacy that no one could ever fully understand. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that she had done her best, and in doing so, she had made the world just a little bit brighter. Because every life mattered. Every story mattered. And this story, this boy's story, was proof that hope was the most powerful medicine of all.